Um, as Pilar said, I direct the Master's Concentration in Creativity and Cognition here. I'm a psychologist with a distinctly philosophical bent. And I've just finished a book on the history of psychological theories of creativity. So I know a reasonable amount about that, maybe more than a reasonable person should know, actually. But I don't have any particular expertise in the opportunities for change across the Americas, which is the focus of this conference. So I'm going to stick to what I know. And that means that for just a few minutes here, I'm going to be a bit meta on you and take us up to thinking about creativity in a large sense, but in a way that has been informed by teaching for 15 years here at Teachers College and working with education, and thinking specifically about how pragmatically do we use this idea in educational contexts to come out with real outcomes. There is a lot of rhetoric out there about creativity these days. A really wonderful creativity researcher, Anna Kraft, has called creativity and I'm going to paraphrase here, I'm not going to get the quote exactly right, but an essential part of the zeitgeist of the early 20th century worldwide. It is an idea that has grown up over the last 200 years and has really taken off recently. One of the things that I have found is that for all of the rhetoric about creativity being essential to individual success, to individual fulfillment, to economic growth, to human survival, to addressing issues such as environmental factors, crises, and economic crises, it's a little more complex than the rhetoric would lead you to believe. So I'm going to take you into some of that complexity today and hopefully open it up. My goal is, as we go into what's going to be an amazing set of discussions and panels, a really wonderful lineup today, is to back up just a minute and think about the discursive space that an idea like creativity opens up. And also the spaces it can tend to foreclose, because it can do both. I'm going to start this process by looking, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have gone with the mic there. I'm going to start this process by maybe opening up a little space for us and talking about some of the assumptions that we've probably all brought into the room around creativity, right? There are a lot of, like I said, it's out there in the air around us. And so we come in with a lot of beliefs and assumptions that it's good to think about as we go through these sorts of discussions. One is that it's such a familiar idea to us, it's sort of easy to forget that the way we think about creativity is very new. I'm going to do just the 3-minute history of creativity, concept of creativity overview for you. There's been some wonderful scholarship on this in the last 15 years in intellectual history. And I'm going to talk about it in terms of European and American development, and then I'll talk a little bit more globally. The verb creare is Latin, right? It means to make, grow. And the Romans used it metaphorically around artistic work sometimes, but they were a very traditional culture. It was not a big value for them. The verb creare is also the first line of the Latin Vulgate, the translation of the Christian Bible, and God created the heavens and the earth. And throughout most of the Middle Ages, it was blasphemous in Europe to say that people created things. Only God created. In the Renaissance, things open up a little bit. In Christian theology, humans are made in the image of God. And so there was the idea that people could do creative work and work could be creative. But until the mid-19th century, that idea was viewed as dangerous and as much to be discouraged as valuable and to be promoted. Creativity was seen as to be creative, there was no creativity, to be creative was seen as being a dangerous act very often. Think of the early 19th century, Frankenstein, right? Mary Shelley writes Frankenstein, this idea of what technology can do run wild. It is and a guy named John Mason has done wonderful scholarship on this, it is in the late 19th century that we tend to fall away from that idea that there's danger involved and look at it as a wholly positive thing. And that now has come, the dangerous aspect has come back in just very recent discourses in like the last 10 to 15 years, and I'll get to that in just a minute. So the word creativity, by the way, there's creativeness starts showing up in the early 19th century, but the word creativity itself was coined in 1875, and it does not show up in most American dictionaries till after World War II. So this idea of the way we think about it is psychologized, as a force that you nurture or that you squelch. This is really very new. And by the way, very American. In the 1950s, psychology stepped in and sort of took this idea as its own. And since then, a lot of the work on creativity has been in psychology particularly. The early work really emphasized individualism. Remember you know outside the box, right? That idea that we are such individuals that we can step out of all of our knowledge and culture and somehow think outside of the constructs in which we live. This is less and less taken for granted or even accepted by theorists today. And we tend more and more to think of individuals as building boxes, distinctive habits of thought, distinctive ways of seeing the world, which they then bring and in their participation in culture. But we have a long legacy of really extreme individualism. And the idea is not yet stable, because just within the last literally few years, the sociocultural views have been around since the 1980s, but really the sociocultural views have taken off huge momentum just in the last few years, where we think not just of the individual who has the idea, not just of having an idea, but of the whole social system that integrates novelty into culture. We don't think of culture so much as the bad guy. We think of individuals as culturally constituted and working within culture. And we even think of the world as an actor in that. We think of the actors of institutions and buildings and museums and collections and how they function in those systems of novelty integration. Okay, is everybody's eyes glazed over now? Enough for that piece of history. This leads to a few things. Thinking of it as a construct and not necessarily a thing in the world. Kurt Danziger has done some wonderful work on the history of psychology and psychological methods, and he talks about the way we often think of psychology in terms of the fairy tale of Sleeping Beauty. He says, you know, we act as if there are things out in the world asleep, and the magical kiss of the researcher prince comes and it enlivens them all of a sudden. Whereas he goes through the hard work of constructing an idea and the controversies. And indeed, I will suggest to you that what creativity is today is more a site of controversy than an answer to anything. And some of those controversies are very important. What is the relationship of the individual to culture? What is it to have individual agency? How does change function? And how do we evaluate change, whether it's in a world where we seem to think it cannot be stopped? I'm going to suggest one way to talk about it is as an idea, particularly modern idea, that we use to manage, evaluate, and participate in change. Change at the individual level, change at the group level, change at the social level, change at the historic level. So psychology takes over, and you know, there's always pros and cons to everything, right? Psychology, in our methodologies, we tend to isolate variables. We need discriminant validity. And that has led to some fascinating research on things like development and ideation and motivation. But it has also led practically to some assumed dichotomies that really don't work in the real world. The first one that I have up here is creativity versus tradition. Lots of research says that you've probably heard of the 10-year rule, or many of you may have. Lots of research says that for people to do things that are truly significant in a historic sense, and there are many levels of creativity, but I'm going to stick with the historic one for a minute because that is sort of the limit case. People need to work in their domain in an immersive way for 10 years. You have to have extraordinary expertise before you come up with a world-changing sort of idea. That's an average. Lots of different methodologies have come to that same conclusion. At the same time, how do we define creativity? There's a consensus that, believe it or not, we agree on something, and that it's something of novelty that is of value. How do we know it's of value? How do we know it's not just weird, crazy, foolish? We know that because somebody judges it to be that way. That works at the individual level, by the way. I mean, I love to cook, right? So I just served the other night a new Indian-inspired dish, a chicken dish. And it wasn't that I thought it was creative, it's what my guests thought that mattered to me. And if they had all retched, it would not have been creative. We do this very much on the historic level, too. It is by being Einstein, Picasso, the Curies, any of this these new ideas, it is after this integrated into culture that we declare it creative. So what's the paradox here? The study of creativity for us is the study of evolution of traditions. It starts with traditions, it starts with existing knowledge, people remix it, add to it, tweak it in some way, and it ends with tradition, once it becomes part of culture again. It's just a little blip in between. So the dichotomy between tradition and creativity really doesn't stand up. As I said, the individualism of the mid-20th century made culture the bad thing. And it also made our own self bad. If you remember all that Gestalt work that they did on problem solving, it was you have to get around the blockages in your own assumptions. Your own knowledge was getting in your way. More and more people think, and again, we'll go to the inside and outside the box, more and more people think, no, it's how you organize your knowledge toward creative goals that makes the difference, not whether you have the knowledge. And then there's creative versus bad. And this comes up so often in literature. You will literally see it's either creative or it's bad. Not good or bad, and not even going back to the tradition idea and not saying creative or conventional, but creative or bad. Now remember I said we agree on this idea that it's something novel and of value? Well, any of us who've been around very long know that value is not a monolithic concept. Value is perspectival. There are winners and losers in any change. Value is not stable. What's valuable today may not be tomorrow, and this is really true in creativity. All that rhetoric about how wonderful it is very seldom talks about how those big problems we're looking at are often rooted in things that are typically considered creative. We're dealing with environmental crises today that come out of the Industrial Revolution and all of those inventions. More recently, do you guys remember mortgage-backed securities? They were the basis of, or one of the key factors for the economic collapse of 2008. Those were considered extraordinarily creative. And they made lots of people lots of money. They were creative for lots of people, but not for others and not for the system ultimately. So one of the emerging discourses really is about ethics and creativity, and another one is about the many dangers of what's been called the dark sides of creativity. So the complexity. So we come up with many definitions. And this is an idea I am really ashamed to say after 14 years of teaching this, not until I was writing this book did I realize this, that these different definitions of creativity, like as coming up with a list of ideas like brainstorming, right? Or insight, sudden insight into something, or long-term development of building your box, they don't depend so much on the definition of creativity, but the definition of an idea that we want to look at. Brainstorming was developed by a guy named Alex Osborne in the 1950s, and he was from advertising. And if you think about what brainstorming does, you get a list of ideas, right? It's perfect for an advertising creative team. And you want lots of ideas on a creative team because you may have to present 2 or 3 to a client. It turns out that divergent thinking doesn't, and when you do case studies of people who do long-term work in science and art, it isn't used so much. It doesn't seem, we have very little evidence that those people rely on divergent thinking that much. I believe what you guys and the rest of the day, what we're going to be talking about, are long-term systemic changes. And so I really encourage us to think in terms of what are our resources, who are the actors, all the actors, not just the ones with the ideas, but the ones who implement the ideas, the reviewers, the gallery owners, the museums, the impresarios, everybody, all the audiences, and the world itself, all the artifacts that transmit information, technology, as I said, institutions, museums, art pieces themselves, how these affect long-term systemic integration of novelty. Okay, so we are, but psychologists love to wring our hands over definitions. I had another aha moment. Okay, I've actually had this several times before I got it. Is that another way, and a really important issue, and especially what we're talking about today, opening up the discursive space, is how the idea functions in conversation. And I'm going to give you, what do I mean by that? I'm going to give you just a few examples that over the years me and my students have gathered. One is it orients us toward the unconventional. And we just saw Pilar do this, right? She set us up and said, what we're going to be working with here is an orientation toward unusual ideas in a variety of different contexts. And that kind of orientation, then you bring your expertise in, and then you don't worry about the idea of creativity anymore. It's the orientation that part. Another is that it orients you toward the future. This is a very future-oriented idea. It's a roll up your sleeves, get to work, make something happen idea. It is not, by the way, so good or so orienting often toward evaluation of blame, which can work very nice if you happen to be to blame. There are some things that happen when you orient toward the future. One is you have a heightened attention to possibility. And having taught the program here for 15 years, one of the things I have come to realize is that my students who really study these theories in depth, one of the key takeaways they have is a greater appreciation or sensibility of the possible. There's not so much, oh, it's going to happen like this, or oh, we know this, or definitely we can prove this. It's much more a critical, skeptical, and a thought, no, there are possibilities here. Another is a placeholder for hope. This is a construct about change. Change is scary. The future can be very scary. If you are in a culture like ours that embraces change, unlike most in history that have tried to ward off change, you need something that's going to help you have hope in the face of that scariness. We use creativity a lot for that. Those both sound pretty good, although I imagine you can think of situations where they might not work so well. But another thing it does is it tends to devalue the present. And here's where I would warn us. Again, I go back to this idea of long-term systemic use of present resources. Think about what the present resources are. Think about who the actors are. Think about what the knowledge bases are. Think about what the institutions are. Think about who the politicians are. Think about who the reviewers are. Think about all of the resources and how they work together. Oops, how did that happen? Another synonym. How am I doing on time? I'm okay? Okay. Another is a synonym for recess. Not serious. This was one of my aha moments. I do a lot of work in curriculum development, and there's a huge curriculum project. There are 20 people working on it, and we were a half-day meeting, so 4 hours a meeting. I mean, any of you have been in a 4-hour meeting, you know what those are like. You cannot put enough cookies on the table for those meetings. And so about 2/3 of the way through, the leader of the group says, okay, we're getting a little stuck on something. She says, okay, let's be creative. What could we do differently here? It was fascinating. 20 people around the table. 1/3 of them leaned forward, smiled, and started talking. 2/3 of them sat back and got out their phones. We batted around some ideas, etc., and about probably 5 or 10 minutes, and then there was a pause. It was almost exact 3 count. And then the leader said, so where were we? And we went exactly back to where we had started, and people put away their phones, and we started working again. It is a sense that it's not serious things, right? These days I have enough of a reputation of being a really hard professor that it doesn't happen much, but when I first started teaching this stuff, I would get a lot of students who would drop out because this looked way too hard. I thought this was about creativity. Promotes diversity. Like I said, I've just written this book on the history of creativity, and one of the most fascinating things is that throughout, no matter what the theories are, the promotion of diversity has been a consistent theme. Go with me on a little bit of a thought experiment here. Let's say you've got this group of people, and they have enormous resources and opportunities. They're a little rigid in their thinking. They're kind of obsessed with organizational charts. They have a long history of racial exclusions and a pretty rigid system of gender roles. How do you get these people to loosen up? How do you get them to think of new ideas? How do you get them to listen to different people? It'd be nice if we had like a ritual that we could teach to they could teach to their children, and everybody would know it, and it would be a practice in doing this sort of thing. It would be great if it related to things they really wanted to do. We don't have to talk about the diversity thing so much. And it'd be really nice if it had just a little bit of magic, right? Any good ritual should have some magic. This is, I propose, brainstorming in the 1950s. America is in this amazing position. We come up with this idea of brainstorming, and it's originally proposed as the idea that if we all get together and we all share ideas without judging them, so there's a practice, a consistent practice that we do not judge ideas. We entertain all ideas, all of our weird ideas and all everybody else's ideas, and everybody in the room speaks and everybody's ideas put up. Then we will get more better ideas. That's not true. We have decades of research. You get more better ideas if everybody goes to their desk and thinks. That definitely does not work. But brainstorming is something that every American child and every American adult, I will say it's something more people know how to do than any other ritual in our culture. Everybody knows how to brainstorm. And what it has done, I think one of the functions of this idea is that it brings out this idea of entertaining any idea and entertaining it from any source. It does a lot of other things in education, by the way. And so there's been some wonderful writing on that, of different ways it can function in the classroom, beyond the thing it doesn't do, which is get you more better ideas. Lots of us demarcations. Start paying attention to what you read. This can come up all the time. Us creatives versus the quants and the suits, the serious people versus the creative people, and in education, what becomes really dangerous, the academic versus the creative. I was just reading the other day a piece about a project-based learning system, and the leader of the system said, we're producing creative students, not scholars, which really gave me the shivers as an education person. Individualizing power and responsibility. There's a lot. We will talk about systemic problems, and we will look to our entrepreneurs and our inventors to save us from those problems. You can see this a lot, again, in the discourse. I'm not saying that's not possible. I have a very good heightened sense of possibility. But I really do think that a sense of the systemic has to be held as well as the individual. And I said that we're becoming much more sociocultural in the way we look at creativity. No one has said that individual agency is not important. It is still the site at which we explore the idea of individual agency. But it is a much more complex view than just getting outside the box. And then a code. For neophilia, any new idea is good. Technophilia, any technological idea is good. Ageism, since I'm getting to geezer status, I'm particularly susceptible to that. We need fresh, creative blood. So there's a variety of different functions, and this is just a sampling that you can see in discourse. So what are you supposed to do with this? I don't know, be creative. What did I do just then, right? I hopefully empowered you to some extent, and also deflected responsibility just a little bit. I do have a couple of ideas. That's going to surprise you, I know. As you go through the day, I really encourage you to do everything that you thought you would do in a creative discussion. Have a sense of liberty, exchange ideas, build on ideas, have a sense of possibility, really have fun, right? In addition, I would suggest you hold these ideas in mind. How do we relate the idea of creativity to your other goals? Or a couple of ways of thinking about this. One is, if you weren't saying creativity here, what would you say? I tell my education students all the time to think in paragraphs, not in sentences. If you say, I want my students, I'm going to go with education since that's what I know. If you say, I want my students to be creative, that really doesn't help an educator very much. There are too many definitions, too many ways to think about it, too many contexts. But if you say, you know, my students are really highly motivated to success, but they are so motivated they're always looking for the right answer and they don't explore other possibilities. Therefore, I'm going to use brainstorming to make sure to give them a greater awareness that there are other possibilities and to help them entertain those, to be creative. Alternatively, I had a student just a few years ago who said, music teacher, she said, I don't see what I'm going to do here. My students are all slackers. They come in, they don't ever practice, they say, I'm being creative. Okay, for those students, you go to case studies and you show them how long John Coltrane practiced, how much work Stravinsky went through. You talk about the work part and then use the psychosocial technologies of case studies to help them understand that. What is the relationship between tradition and this creativity? Again, this is this idea of resources, right? What are the resources that we're going to be using, including the physical world? What are the roles of those participating in change, developing ideas and integrating into social systems? Lots of roles, not just having the idea. And then what are the dangers and ethics of the situation? Really thinking long term. You know, there was a sociocultural theorist, very famous, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who wrote a lot. You may know him for the idea of flow. He also wrote a lot about creativity theory. And he generally promoted, he was very much a promoter of the idea of creativity. But he also wrote about the dangers, and specifically the dangers of the ways we integrate information and the tendency of any given field of a domain like art or technology to fight for itself for resources and maybe not serve the greater good. And he wondered whether, he used a line from Jonas Salk, and wondering whether we could develop field functions that would make us good ancestors. And I think that is a really good idea to hold in mind as we're thinking about change and creating things and changing domains in our worlds and different cultural patterns. Is this being a good ancestor? And how can we assure that going forward? That's it. I think we have a couple of minutes for questions, if there are, or discussions or thoughts. Rebellion.
And my question is, so can you speak a little bit more about the type of discourses and counter discourses in places that honor more, like, let's say, tradition, culture, or collectivism, and what type of, you see what I mean?
Absolutely,
like, yeah.
absolutely.
Thank
yes,
you.
And thank you. Actually, I meant to talk about that, because when I went through the history, I said I'm going to talk about Europe and America. But all cultures, right, have constructs for how they're going to evaluate and think about change. And one of the issues that, again, just in the last, probably after the turn of the century, the theorists, at least, have started thinking about, is recognizing that in cultures where creativity is not assigned to an individual, right, or where creativity is not paradigm breaking, but more subtly interpretive, a lot of the methodologies that we've developed in American psychology and sociology don't even work. We can't even isolate it, right? So that's why these participatory models have come up. And what the participatory models look at, which I'm a great advocate of, it really is asking the question, not how do I come up with a new idea, although that's part of the overall process. It is, how do I participate in change? And now there are several roles there, right? One of the things that's been deconstructed is the idea that the individual comes up with an idea at all. And I'll use Freud as an example because he's one of the people I traced through my book, right? A man who really changed the world of psychology in many ways. Yet he developed those ideas with a close circle of advisors. In particular, Otto Rank brought in a lot of the mythology and literature issues, right? And he developed them in those discussions and often just really stole ideas. For which he got the credit. It's possible to think of him as a producer, or even, I like to think, a curator of ideas. He was the instigator and the one who pushed things forward in sometimes a maniacal way. But he was not necessarily the originator of all those ideas. They did not come out of whole cloth. And this idea of the author function, if you're any good Foucaultians in here, or Barth as well, this idea that we assign all of these ideas to a particular individual is a way that we have learned to organize our intellectual terrain, right? It's not necessarily the socioculturalists who talk about participation. It's not the way it really happens. It's really always collaborative to some degree or another, and you're taking different roles. And again, then you go to your field roles. There's a great, often used YouTube clip about the guy who gets up and dances in the middle of the park, and crazy, and then somebody else dances, and it's used, I think, well, maybe it's a TED Talk, and it's used to illustrate the idea that the first guy has the idea, but if no one else gets up, it's just weird. It's the second person who says, oh, this is a good idea. And that is sort of the way the participatory approach works. It's that how are all the people involved? Does that answer your question a little bit? Thank you. Other thoughts or questions? Yeah.
So, as an individual, do you think creativity? So as an individual, can the creative is it like a talent or a skill that some people have, or can it be developed or learned, or you know how some people might, I'm not that creative, I'm gonna go, I'm gonna study finances because I'm not that creative. And you can be creative even in finance, in the finance world or whatever. And is it something innate or a talent or a skill?
Well, that's where we started, right? In the 1950s, when they started this whole psychological discourse, it was a guy named J.P. Guilford was president of the American Psychological Association, and he got up in front of all these behaviorists and IQ testers and said, we have to study creativity, which you could imagine how popular that made him. But it caught on. And what they were looking for was divergent thinking, which is a trait. It is not, by the way, a measure of creativity. And don't get me started on that because it'll go way too long. But it's not a measure of creativity. It is at best a measure of an estimate of a potential, and maybe not even that in a pragmatic sense. But we were looking for that trait, right? We were looking for the trait, the thing, and we were putting it in the person. It was in the individual. I come from, and I really believe in developmental models. You become creative not because you have a particular trait or not. You use your traits and you organize them, and you organize your knowledge around what you want to do. So I get back to the question, how do I participate in change? So if you want to change the way an education system works in a particular locality, then you take all of your resources, and it's not a short-term thing. It's a very long-term development of that box that you're going to work in. Because most of us build our boxes to be conservative, to be approved by others, to follow the rules, to not deviate too much. So you have to reorganize your box in such a way that you're going to figure out new ideas, you're going to explore new ideas, you're going to have methods of doing that, and you're going to build the depth of knowledge and resources to do that. I really believe in the developmental model. I think anybody can be creative, but I don't think everybody has to be creative. I don't think that there's imperative that you're not a good person if you're not creative. It's as if, it's as if everybody wants to change the world, but no one wants to maintain it, right? Everybody, no one wants to, what are we going to do with the scholars? What are we going to do with the virtuosos? What are we going to do with the people who pass on? People who spend their whole life studying other people's ideas. Does that mean they're not worthwhile? I think they're very worthwhile, having just written a history book, because I relied on a lot of those people. So it's not, everybody doesn't have to be creative, and everybody doesn't have to be creative in everything they do. The humanists had this idea of self-actualization, very, very individualistic, and they thought you were creative in everything. The divergent thinking people originally thought everything. I would say the majority of the evidence now is divergent thinking is domain-specific. It's a skill. You tend to think divergently in one way, in one area or another. It's a controversy, however. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Most intriguing presentation. Let me go back to the 1950s, yes. Because I was alive then. And Sal Hurok, who was known as an impresario and whom most of you probably have never heard of. Sal Hurok supposedly was the one person who kept Russia and the United States from going to nuclear war. I mean, this is a myth, because he brought over from Russia cultural performers, such as the Moisheyev dancers. Now, you wouldn't think that anything like this would have an impact on anything, but it was the one creative link that was able to keep sort of people at least feeling that they weren't going to be destroyed by a nuclear bomb, because Sal Hurok was bringing a cultural performance to the United States and vice versa. Could you comment on adversity and how creativity can sort of be catapulted by adversity?
Oh, yes, and indeed, I think on many levels. That is a wonderful example. And not only of adversity, but also of the unexpected nature of systems, right? The thing that you don't expect. If you were sitting down and saying, how do we prevent war between the USSR and America, that is not what you would come up with on your top 10 list. Yet the unexpected part of systems is really important. Adversity. I mean, this idea is born out of adversity, right? I mean, 1950 is when that speech was made. 1955, you have Carl Rogers and you have Maslow working, and they are specifically citing the Cold War. They're saying, in the Cold War, we need creativity for these reasons. When Guilford makes his speech, it is in order for business and government to compete in today's world. And in 1950, that was code for against the Soviet Union. So the whole thing comes out of adversity. And by the way, at the individual level, that's true as well. We have a lot of data about correlations between having difficult childhoods and creative achievement. We often think of creativity, and there's a whole discourse today around play and creativity, right? And we often think of it as innocence. And that was probably true, that our innate tendency to play gets carried through. Yet it is adversity that seems to push people toward seeing the world, experiencing the world, and telling others about the world in a different way. Thank you. Yes. Okay. One more question.
So I do believe that there are some fields and let's say some industries that value more creativity. And I think that academics overall in the economic sector don't value creativity as much above all despite after the financial crisis of 2008. So I always wonder, I want to know your opinion about how do we promote creativity in our economic system to develop economic growth, because the United States is growing, but inequality is increasing. So we do definitely think about creative ways to get these people to enjoy the economic growth in the same way.
Right. Very good question. And that different domains. So, we have in creativity theory this idea of a domain. Like art is a domain, and literature is a domain, economics is a domain. Domains like creativity don't exist out there in the world. They're things we construct. And we do it a lot in education, by the way, by whether you go to literature class or history class or whatever, with how you learn your matrices of knowledge. Some, like economics, tend to be they tend to have, and physics as well, lots of others, tend to have very highly structured truth conditions. And those highly structured truth conditions can appear to be uncreative, and often they are, but they also provide a really distinct way of saying when something is going to be integrated. Think of Einstein's concept of relativity. Csikszentmihalyi said there were about 5 people in the world who knew enough to say, yes, this is right. But it was such a structured domain that they could do that. You couldn't do that with Picasso's Demoiselle d'Avignon. It took a while. You have to have lots of people weigh in, right? And it has to be integrated over time. So that's one. You look at the domain and you say, okay, where are the points at which you might intervene, given that it is highly structured? What are the controversies that are there that we might answer in a different way? That's one way. The other goes back to the Soviet Union, right? That there are other interventions that you may not be looking at. And you think as broadly and systemically as you can, because economics exists within a broader culture of other domains and affects many of them. But I think you're right. I think that is an extraordinarily important question. Okay, I think time is up. I'm going to be around some today, but I won't be around for the whole thing, but have a wonderful day.
Thank you.